welcome back. We are going to start our next panel. My name is Lindsay Harris. I'm a professor and actually chair of the appointments committee this year at the University of San Francisco School of Law across the Bay, and we are hiring, so if anyone is interested in learning more about USF, feel free to chat with me afterwards. I am serving as the moderator for this panel, and so we're not going to do bios and lengthy introductions. I'm going to introduce our panelists and just say their name and institutions. And then they're each going to talk for about 10 minutes with some thoughts on teaching. Please do jot down your thoughts and questions, and then we will have most of our time really for Q&A at the end. So directly next to me, this is Greg Ablavsky, who teaches at Stanford Law. And then in the middle, we have Kristen Holmquist, who teaches here at Berkeley. And then at the very end, Norris, who is at Santa Clara Law. So we didn't actually decide on an order of speaking, which we probably should have in these moments.
Kristen's
going to go first and kick things off. So thank you, Kristen.
Yes. Hi and welcome. Again, I am Kristen Holmquist. I am a teaching professor of law here at Berkeley, which is what it sounds like, that my responsibilities are kind of flipped compared to the average tenure track person, that I have more teaching responsibilities and fewer creative research responsibilities. And I say that only because maybe some of you would be interested in such a thing, and so I'm happy to answer questions about it. And I am going first because I am talking about the most basic pieces of teaching. I think of teaching as very much a simple but not easy kind of thing. And so I'm going to keep my remarks simple. Certainly one thing that is true about teaching is unloading 17 ideas on you in 7 to 10 minutes is a terrible idea. And so I am going to lump mine together into 3 basic rules. My rules for teaching are, and I promise I will explain them a little bit, know what you want to teach, care that they learn it, and don't be an asshole. All right, goodbye. So know what you want to teach. That is so much easier said than done, especially when you are first teaching. You probably will not be designing your own courses. You probably will be modifying somebody else's syllabus, someone who has already put their own thought into the class. And it is so easy when you are first starting to teach to care mostly about what I want to teach is what they tell me to teach. I am teaching contracts, and the book says this is contracts, and so that is what I am doing. But trust me that you will not be able to communicate to your students in a clear way about why it is they're learning what they're learning if you haven't thought that through yourself. So I think it's important to think about what's my story for the whole semester, right? What is a contract? I teach contracts. What is a contract, right? What is the story that I'm going to want to weave in and out of and tap into every day so that the students can see that it's not just a series of ideas, but is actually a whole there, right? So the whole semester. Every week, why are the topics in the order that they are in? I am sure that if we took a poll in here, we all learned contracts in very different orders. And there are good reasons for each of those, but know why your reason is your reason. Same thing about every case. I think it's important to know why you have chosen to include every case, what it has to do with the topic for that week or 2 weeks or whatever, and what it has to do with the story as a whole. I go into class, I've been teaching for, I don't know, a lot of years. And I go into class every day reminding myself, what are the 3 sentences I need students to be able to say about this case when we leave? Because if we don't get to those 3 sentences, that means we're not done with that case yet. I don't believe that you have to tell students what that whole story is, why you've done things in the order that you have, what the 3 sentences for each case are. You might, like, there are different styles there, but it will inform how you talk about the cases, what questions you ask, etc. So know what you want to teach. The second one is care that they learn it. Again, easier said than done. Mostly in the beginning, you're gonna care about, do I not sound dumb? Can I be funny? Are they paying attention? Like, just like the basics, can I hold them, right? But that's not teaching, that's performing. And you want to be thinking about other things. And so I could go through a whole long list of things, but I think the big ones are provide them some scaffolding, make sure you repeat things way more times than you think appropriate, and provide feedback along the way, one way or another. So scaffolding, there are a bunch of different ways. I'm not saying my way is the right way, but here is a way. I begin every class with review. Sometimes, depending on where we are in the semester, it is whole, like, here's where we are in the syllabus, here's where we've been, what we did yesterday, and how that fits in with what we did with this whole syllabus, and here's where we're about to go, and here's where it fits in the whole syllabus. I do that because I find that students are very, very good at being in the weeds in any given day and have a much harder time thinking about how it fits together with what else we have done. So I provide that scaffolding. Plus, if they learn to take notes while you're doing that every day, they've got their outline at the end of the semester from just their notes from the first 5 minutes of class. So scaffolding. Repetition. It is so tempting to think, and it's true, these are smart people, right? Like, I just don't want to bore them. But I promise you, just because you've said it doesn't mean they've heard it. And you need to repeat things so that they have a way in whenever they're ready for it to be. And I'm not saying dumb it down, I'm just saying come back to themes so they can find their way in when they're there. So again, I have phrases that I repeat all of the time at the beginning of each semester, so again, they can see how things fit together. And even when I'm trying to get them to learn a concept, I'll hit on, a particular thing 3 or 4 times in the course of the class, and make sure to hit it again the next day. Repetition is important. And then feedback. Depending on where you end up teaching, a lot of law school is not terribly well set up for providing feedback to students, but you may be in a setting where you can give them some written feedback on work over the semester. But I feel strongly at least oral feedback in class so that they can have some sense of where they are they learning, et cetera. So sometimes that's just through the Socratic method, meaning when they answer a question, you respond to their answer rather than just moving on. Sometimes it's, doing problems at the end of units or whatever, but making sure they get some opportunity for feedback along the way. And then my last one, don't be an asshole. That's really just a catchier way of saying that it's important that they trust you. There is a ton of information and evidence that students try harder, are more willing to take risks, want to learn if they trust their teacher. Now, obviously, trust is a relational thing. You can't make them trust you. But there are some things you can do to encourage trust. One is, so this is going to sound so touchy-feely, but be authentic. I credit this with Dr. Spock, not Dr. Star Trek Spock, but Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor guy. I actually don't know if it's him who said, there's a lot of different ways to show up as a parent, and your kids will see right through you if you're trying to be a parent that's different from who you actually are. I believe the same thing about teaching. You have to show up as yourself in the classroom. I got so many admonitions in the beginning of my teaching. You got to be mean and strict on the first few days, and you can always loosen up. There's no way. I am just incapable of being mean and strict, and so it was a disaster. So I had to find another way through. So you need to show up as yourself. But other pieces of trust are have high standards. I think it is important to have high expectations and to communicate those high expectations to them, but also that you believe with your guidance they can get there, right? That I'm going to hold you to this, and we're in it together, and we're going to get there. And then the literal don't be an asshole part is like, yeah, just don't be an asshole. Like, just, they are human beings. They are intimidated by you, I promise. It is so hard to remember that I am the scary person in the front of the room, but I am the scary person in front of the room. And so just the more I can, in an authentic to myself kind of way, find a way to communicate that this is a joint project, right? And that I am here to provide guidance along the way. Just the more more likely they are to trust you in the end. So, make them know that you have high standards, but you believe they can do it. Be a decent human being with them and kind of be true to yourself. So those are my 3 basic rules. And again, I'm happy to talk about any of those or about what it means to be a teaching professor or whatever when we get there.
Yay. Thank you so much for that. I was sitting here taking notes, and I've been teaching for 11 years, so that's, I think, one thing I would add on teaching is you're always learning and always experimenting and integrating new ideas and new things. But let's go to Laura for your thoughts.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Hi, first off, about me. My name is Laura Norris, and I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Santa Clara University. And I'm also a clinical professor of law. So I am in my 13th year as a full-time faculty member. I joined the faculty to start their entrepreneurs clinic. So, I am on the clinical path. That includes at Santa Clara, by the way, our writing faculty. So our writing faculty and our clinical faculty are on the clinical path. And I just wanted to say, I know this is not about teaching, but I wanted to say, to clarify a little bit, because we heard a lot about scholarship earlier in the first 2 panels. And it's important for you to understand when you're evaluating what sort of position to apply to, whether if you were going to apply to a writing role or a clinical role, whether you need to have scholarship or not. We do not have to at Santa Clara. So if there is a position that opens up for legal writing or clinical at Santa Clara, you do not have to have written anything or even have a desire to write anything. We're really looking at teaching and service. Okay, so I have a few notes about teaching, and to take kind of a different path than Kristen did, because she has such amazing points about the actual doing of the teaching that I just love. I also, she had sent the notes around in ahead of time, and I have them now saved so that I can keep looking at them. I just wanted to talk a bit about, for you as prospective faculty, prospective hires into a faculty position, what you might want to consider with regard to teaching and how that fits into what you're doing. So I have 4 points. The first point is to understand what your role as a teacher might look like could differ between schools. And I know it might seem kind of maybe frustrating and confusing when you're applying, that you're trying to convey a certain standard when you're putting your application together, and you hear different things from different schools. And I'm sorry to say that's kind of the way it is, because it does look very different as to what the particular schools are looking for with regard to teaching. So understanding, for instance, what types of courses that they're looking for you to teach. We heard from Dean Cherinsky earlier that that they care very much at Berkeley when they're hiring someone, what classes you actually said you were going to teach, right? But understanding, is that a 1L doctrinal kind of course? Is that a bar course? Is that a seminar course? Is that a clinical course? Is it an experiential course? These are all different kinds of courses. And the way that you might approach teaching in those courses might be slightly different, right? And also, it can really vary based on the institution you go to as to even the number of students. Like a 1L section at some schools might look like 60 to 70 students. A 1L section at other schools might look like 150 students. And obviously, your ability to connect individually with the students in your class and how you might approach making sure that everyone in the room is coming along for the ride and that they're staying up on the subjects, it may require some different techniques, right, to make sure everyone's coming along on the ride with you. And so One of the things, too, that you would want to understand is if you are applying to a legal writing or a clinical position, some schools encourage or require you to also teach doctrinal courses alongside those other types of courses, like a legal writing course or a clinical course. Other schools are like, those two shall never meet. You do not teach doctrinal if you're getting hired into this clinical or writing kind of role. That's an important thing for you to understand, because if you really do think that you want the experience of being able to teach a big kind of doctrinal podium class, you'd want to know whether that's kind of prohibited if you apply to one track versus another track. So that's a question that you might want to ask. With regard to, and I'm only speaking from my personal opinion, I've been involved with quite a few searches for both clinical faculty and for tenure track faculty, but like my colleague Eric said earlier, these are my opinions, but some of the things that we look for and that you want to be aware of when you're, applying to a school is, we understand that everyone may not have direct teaching experience. But we also need to be convinced that you will be able to be an effective teacher, not just of the subject matter that you've said. In fact, the subject matter might even be secondary. It's more about, do you have the ability to teach our student population? And at different schools, student populations look different. Particularly at Santa Clara, we are a mission-driven school. With our Jesuit mission, we admit a lot of first-gen students into our population, and we have this interesting thing where we have these incredibly highly motivated, highly talented people who come out of, say, a tech company or the tech industry, and they come and they're part of our class and they expect a certain thing. And then we have people that really don't have at all that perspective. I've never known a lawyer. Maybe they're the first people that are coming through any college education. And they're sitting in the same classroom, right? And we need to feel like you are willing and able to try to understand that population, have the ability to understand that population, and especially if you have this background that says that you went to really, prestigious top 10 schools. You never really did any community work where you were potentially working with those types of different sorts of populations. You're going to get questioned about how is it that you would be able to deal with this very broad, diverse group of students in the classroom and be able to ensure that you can teach to all of them. And so just thinking about that, it could be through, like I said, mentoring or volunteering or teaching in other contexts that are not the law school, but we're going to look at that to try to assess that. We also expect at Santa Clara, we have this Jesuit principle called cura personalis, which means care for the whole person. And the way that that gets implemented at our law school is we try to take every student where they are and see them where they are and help them specifically with their particular situation, which means that our faculty tend to try to personally get to know the students in their class and provide some advising, be very available to them. That, again, might look very different depending on which school you're in, but that's something that we're also looking for, is a desire to be able to advise our students and want to interact with that pool of students. And so that's point 2, is to understand what priorities the particular school might have with regard to teaching. The third point is kind of along the lines of what my colleague Eric said earlier and what Kristen said, and I'll just say it again, which is you have to be your authentic self. What that means is everybody's got different teaching styles. So we have some incredibly effective teachers in our population. I kind of think of them in 3 different groups. We have the performers. They're great at telling jokes. I don't know how they pull that off. They're great at telling jokes. They don't look at notes. They don't need to use slides, and they can stand up and deliver this incredibly entertaining performance. And they're very effective because the students are just transfixed. They're not shopping on their computers and stuff like that in class. They are listening, hanging on every word, right? Very effective, right? But not everybody needs to be that person either. We also have some very effective faculty that are actually kind of quiet and they leave time in the classroom. They'll talk about issues, and they'll invite students to really think about those issues, and then they'll leave space. And I get these great, I read all the reviews of teaching. Those people get great reviews because they feel very much like the professor trusts them and that they have the space to be able to speak up, right? You don't have to be the fast wolf in the room all the time to be able to speak up in those courses. So that could be a very effective way of teaching. And then we also have a group of faculty that I kind of think of them as like airline attendants or something. Like they're like super organized. Let me just show you how all this complicated stuff works. They end up being really great for like bar courses and things like that because, you know, students end up at the end with something kind of like a bar outline because, you know, they're great at keeping the big picture. So you have to figure out what is good for you and don't try to be someone else's style of teaching, right? So the fourth thing I was going to say, the first thing was how your role as a teacher may differ depending on where you go. The second is to look at the priorities of the institution as a whole when you're considering whether you want to apply there. The third, be authentic and find your own teaching style. Fourth, what questions do you want to ask of an institution? Because you're interviewing them as well, right? So I already said one of them, which is try to figure out whether if you got hired on a non-tenure track, if you can teach doctrinal, if that's what you want to do. Asking that question is an important thing. Second, how is your teaching evaluated for promotion? And then is it evaluated even after tenure? Some schools have a post-tenure review where they continue to look and see how you're teaching, you know, if your teaching is effective. And so finding out, do they only look at the student evaluations, which frankly, if anyone's taught like big classes, those are always mixed. You don't make everybody happy, right? Do they have visits? Are you provided a mentor? We at Santa Clara, for every new teacher that comes in, we provide an experienced mentor to help them in their first few years of the school. How large is the 1L section? I already said. And what are your teaching load expectations? You heard Dean Chemerinsky say earlier when he came and give his talk that he doesn't reduce people's teaching loads as a matter of negotiation. But what does that mean? Is it a different teaching load for a tenure track faculty than it is for a writing faculty, than it is for a clinician? And what does that load look like? Really understanding how that would play out in the course of an entire year.
Thank you, Laura. I'll just add as the other Bay Area school that's a little bit in some kind of synergies with Santa Clara as a Jesuit school, as a very mission-focused school. Even just between those two schools that have a lot of similarities, there are differences. So at USF, we have a unitary tenure track for clinical and non-clinical folks or doctrinal folks. I like to say that because in clinics we actually do teach doctrine. You kind of need to know what the law is to practice it. Just this crazy idea. But so you very much could come in as a doctrinal professor and then end up teaching in a clinic for a semester or transitioning to a clinic and vice versa. I teach in both, actually. I teach a doctrinal course and then I also run the human rights clinic. So very, very similar. I'll just say too, for anyone who's interested in clinical teaching, the 7 Northern California schools will be hosting an annual clinical conference. It will be on February 6th on a Friday. Next year, and it'll be hosted at USF. It was at Berkeley last year. It was amazing. So if anyone has clinical inclinations, or just, we talk a lot about pedagogy in the clinical space. So if you're interested in learning more, you're also very welcome to come to that as a non-clinician or as a prospective clinician too. But I will hand over to Greg for final remarks, and then we'll open up to questions.
Okay, great. So I am podium faculty, so ladder, whatever term you want to use. I teach big doctrinal, some smaller doctrinal seminars. I've been on the Stanford faculty for about 10 years now. I wanted to talk about 2 things. First, how you should talk about teaching on the job market, and then second, how you should actually teach, which are not always necessarily the same thing. When we were putting together this panel, one of the things that was discussed, they were like, oh, it'd be good to have a Stanford person on the pedagogy panel because the stereotype is that elite schools like Stanford don't care about teaching. And it is true that much of the conversation is about scholarship when it comes to appointments, but it definitely is not the case that teaching doesn't matter. In fact, both my colleagues care a lot about teaching in the day-to-day, like I feel it, I see it, but also it matters in the hiring process. I've seen it play out in appointments routinely. So you should not think that like, oh, schools like Stanford are just, you're gonna spend all your time talking about your scholarship. So how does this play out? Well, this plays out across several ways that I've seen in the appointments process. One is that when people talk about the job talk and why it matters, one of the things that people will say is that the job talk itself is sort of a preview of how you are in the classroom, right? In terms of being able to clearly explain your scholarship and its stakes and your ability to answer questions fluidly. And so in some ways you should think about the job talk itself as a preview for the kind of teacher that you anticipate being. And one of the reasons that people say why we should place such emphasis on the job talk, which is always a debate that faculties have, is that it stands in for the teaching. Whether that's right, whether it's a great proxy, I think that's a different question, but that is how many people think about it in the appointments process. Okay. What are other questions that you're likely to get about teaching? One question that I got a lot on the market that I was not entirely prepared for, and so I'm passing it along to you, so hopefully you could do better, is people will ask you a lot about which casebook you intend to use, especially for your sort of big doctrinal class. Yes. I think part of it is, sometimes they have a casebook and so maybe they're interested in that, but actually I think it's worth spending some time about in the area, because also it turns out you will have to figure that out down the line anyway. And so it is worth spending a little bit of time sort of taking a look and reopening these casebooks that maybe, and looking beyond the ones that you happen to use when you were in law school and getting a sense for what the reputations for the different casebooks are. I don't think I'd quite realize, like, I teach property, I don't think I'd quite realize just how much, like, their various approaches and their stakes and implications and politics around the casebooks. It's worth at least getting yourself somewhat familiar with those, because in part, I think those are ways to show, again, what they're really asking about, I think, in part with these sorts of conversations is like, have you thought about this area of law? Like, have you thought about what it would look like to teach? And what approach will you take? What are the themes that you plan on drawing out? And then finally, there are these broad set of questions about teaching philosophy, that you might get asked. I always feel like when students ask me about those, I find those frustrating because, and I felt this way, I was, for a couple years, I was a fifth grade teacher, did some ed school, and I always found these discussions of teaching philosophy maddeningly vague and abstract at some level. So I always strongly advise people, just be concrete in your answers to those questions. If you've taught, talk about the things that you've done that have worked, and even if you haven't taught, talk about some of the things that you've thought about that you think might be effective in the classroom. Now, you should tie those back to sort of broader principles of effective pedagogy and teaching, but I really think the more specific and concrete you can be in answering those questions, the more effective you will be. And actually, one of the standard questions that I think we ask in our appointments process that I've been in many committees or small group interviews that gets asked is sort of talk about some moment when a difficult subject came up in the classroom and how you handled that. That's, the kind of thing that they're trying to get at, right, is how you'll be in the classroom. Okay, so that brings me to the second topic of, okay, if you are lucky enough to get the job, how do you actually go about teaching? So one of the things that I find a little frustrating in the way that I feel like people talk about pedagogy in law schools is that so much of the focus is on mastery of the subject and content area, right? What you really need to do is you need to know everything about Fed courts or about contracts or about civil procedure, and that the best teacher is the one who has the deepest knowledge of the area. So my view is that, especially starting out, teaching is maybe 25% about content mastery and about 75% about how is it that you convey the material to the students. Many of the things that Kristen was talking about. And so you should spend a lot of time thinking about the kinds of things that will make you an effective teacher, not of, the particular content, but of just across the board in a law school. And in this context, I've become a big proponent of, and I think the students really appreciate this, like thinking about multiple ways to teach content. And I also suspect, so this ties back to my first topic, but I also suspect that hiring committees are also interested in hearing about this as well. So I think it's good strategy to talk about how you plan on using sort of broader approaches to teaching, potentially than just the traditional Socratic method. So I'll just tell you some of the things that I have experimented with that I've found to be effective. Many of my colleagues are actually very eager to also try and have done really incredible things. And I borrowed a lot from them, which you will inevitably do if you find yourself in this position, right? Like a lot of teaching is just learning from very experienced people to see what they have done. Okay, so what are some of the ways beyond sort of the traditional Socratic approach to convey material? So I've used a number of different approaches. One, and this builds on something Kristen said, at the end of each class, I have some sort of review question to sort of, in the ed school terms, check for mastery, right? And here I actually use sort of multiple choice clicker questions. And what I ended up doing is I had some old multiple choice exams that I had written, and I just cannibalized those and repurposed those multiple choice questions. So every class, there was a chance to sort of review the material. At the end of each unit, I have sort of various problems where they work through, often in small groups. So I think that's also an important approach, so that it's not just the sort of standard instructor, one student. It allows them to sort of use these different approaches. I do things like we do 2 mock oral arguments over the course of the quarter using problems. I have them actually go through and grade a sample exam. I have mock student responses to exam questions, and I give them a rubric and they practice it so that they understand sort of what I might be looking for on the exam, and we talk about how to craft an effective exam response. And that's at the end of each unit. And then the other thing is, and this is always a challenge, is how you grapple with balancing sort of doctrinal material and also thinking about the stakes and context of law and the implications it can have for people out in the world. I try to stress to my students that actually these, although they get presented as flip sides of the 2 sides of a coin, they're really just the same. Like the technical doctrine has incredible implications for people's lives. And so one of the things I try to stress is this is not a dichotomy, this is just grappling with similar questions from different angles. But I try to give them some sort of, again, at the end of each unit, some sort of broader material that gets them to think about the topics and their real world consequences in fresh ways. I also, in the multiple choice questions that I give each day, sometimes I will also include sort of questions that force them to grapple with policy issues and push them to think about what the trade-offs might be in the law, and use those as a way to open up broader sort of what get termed policy discussions in the classroom. I try to vary up lecture styles a little bit too. Sometimes I will sort of use, I'm a legal historian, so sometimes I use a lot of sort of storytelling, trying to give the perspective on who the litigants in the case were and give context and background. That comes, again, being authentic to yourself. That is my natural way of teaching the material. So I just feel like, again, you want to come at the material from lots of different directions, and giving students opportunities that are not just case, let's talk about the case, master the rule, moving on, next case, next rule, but really sort of explore other ways to grapple, to both make sure they have the material clear for themselves, but also change up the format, change up the way that they are being evaluated, change up the sort of the classroom feel and conversation. Okay, that's my 10 minutes, yeah, I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. So we're going to open up to questions. I'll just share 2 thoughts just as a moderator's privileged to build on what Greg said. The flip side of not assuming that elite schools don't care about scholarship is also not assuming that the lower ranked non-elite schools like mine don't care about teaching, don't care about, right? We also care about scholarship, right? Like we very much need our students to be bar ready, to be practice ready, but you're also going to get asked a lot of questions about your research agenda and your scholarship, and we kind of expect you to be publishing or have those ideas. I would just say when you're thinking about the questions in the screening interviews, we're going to be doing some of our screening interviews in a couple weeks. For almost every school, one of those questions is indeed that kind of broad question around what is your teaching philosophy or your style, or share your thoughts about pedagogy, but then learning some of the lingo to make sure that you understand as you engage in more of a back and forth. So, how do you feel about, in the clinical context, directive versus non-directive teaching, right? And that whole spectrum, and knowing what those terms mean. What about formative versus summative assessment, right? Are you kind of evaluating and giving, as Kristen said, those opportunities for feedback as you go through the semester, or is it all at the end? And kind of knowing as you interview with schools, as you go into those screeners, what is the philosophy of that school, right? Learning as much as you can before you go into it so that you're kind of speaking their language. And then, thinking about taking into account different learning styles, thinking about neurodivergence as well. So what questions do you all have? I'll open it up to you. I have a few in mind, but I'd love to hear from the audience. And don't be shy. I took Civ Pro and Fed Courts in this classroom, so it feels very weird being up here. And it's a big, intimidating room. But yeah, question.
Maybe directed to Greg, the historian. A lot of what you described sounds like the way law might have been taught 100 years ago. What's changed and what's changing today?
Well, I think the push toward clinical teaching is probably the biggest shift, right? I mean, a lot, there are still the big podium classes. Now, they've transformed in lots of ways, I think, as well. I could talk about some of those as well. I don't think they were using clicker questions in the 1890s. I think some of the sort of focus not just on sort of formal doctrine, but thinking about context, that's important shifts as well. But no question, some of the basic aspects of a big doctrinal class, those have remained consistent. But I think the biggest difference in most law schools is that increasingly that is supplemented by sort of various kinds of, what is the term the ABA uses for this? Experiential, that's the term, yeah. And I think the rise of experiential learning has been increasingly significant. And it's worth stressing that is not, though the clinics are a really important part of that, it's not limited to clinics. So I don't know how this works at other schools. I can't speak across the board. But so for instance, at Stanford, we have what are called policy labs, which are sort of like a hybrid between a seminar and a clinic, where students often do policy research for clients that are very hands-on and practical, are not legal representation in the same way, but are in this sort of space. So I think the push toward that kind of experiential teaching and learning is a radical difference, and I think one thing that differentiates the modern law school from even, when I went to law school, which was, longer ago than I care to remember, but not that long ago.
Yeah, so I'll put on my Associate Dean of Clinical and Experiential Programs hat, which is a role I played in the past. So the ABA, it's been more than a decade now since the ABA has required those 6 experiential units. And from the way things are trending, there's a current proposal under consideration, right? There's going to be a vote in the coming months, year, on it being more like 12 credits. And that does include all modes of experiential. So simulations, practicums, the kind of policy labs Greg referred to, clinical externships, even moot court, kind of simulation-based classes too. I don't know if you all have other thoughts on that question, and then we have other questions too.
I have just a quick one, which is, in my associate dean role now and working with our dean of students as well, the student population is quite, I don't know if the student population is that different. Our awareness of our student population is very different than it used to be, in that there's a very large number of accommodated students. I think we're near around 20% or so of our students are accommodated for one disability or another. Student mental health is a big focus right now. And so I think also some of the paper chase intimidation style of large podium classrooms is going away. So that, I think, has really changed. And some of our colleagues are abandoning Socratic method entirely and using other methods of teaching, and others are just making it a much more, hug me Socratic method kind of thing. So.
Okay, we'll go in the middle.
In the hiring process now, should we be prepared for questions on the use of AI and freedom of speech questions, and how would you all answer those questions if you were going through it again today?
Ooh, this was going to be one of my questions, was how are you responding to or dealing with the question of AI and the LLMs in the classroom? I'm speaking from one end of the spectrum. My school it was like in Law 360 that we're attempting to be at least the first AI integrated law school, which means that the use of AI models is being woven into our first year LOW class in the second semester. And then like into big required courses like evidence. So we're kind of one end of the spectrum. That's not required for all faculty members, but it's the direction that the school is moving in. And then it's kind of an individual opt-in choice right now for faculty members. But there are obviously the folks in the LRW program are using it. The person teaching evidence is using it. And so I'm wondering where your schools are and where you are personally on that question.
I can say that where our school is right now is we have a policy that gives the freedom to faculty to be able to set their policy. So the policy would be no use of AI for generating content that, especially in regards to an assessment or something, right? However, we have many different faculty that are approaching it starting this fall in very different ways. So I think doing some research about some of the faculty who are writing about teaching and assessments and the use of AI is a great way to kind of just start thinking about it, because if a school does have the ability, they don't have a large coordinated AI rollout kind of program, to have an idea of the kinds of things that you would, be interested in, and really understanding like where you might, if you did want to incorporate it, where you might incorporate it, or if you don't want to incorporate it, how you would deal with that. I think that just being able to have, do a little bit of reading up on that subject would be a good idea. Yeah.
So I have two quick answers to this. I mean, one is that both of the things you flagged, AI and the free speech questions, those are often areas where there might be a law school-wide policy, right? And so it might be that this is sort of not entirely something that individual instructors can fully decide, and so it's worth paying attention to that and thinking about that. The second answer is that no one has yet figured these fully out, and so I don't know that you should feel like, oh, there's a wrong answer to this. I mean, it's funny you asked this question because we literally just had a couple weeks ago this roiling discussion about what our AI policy should be, and I think that's where a lot of schools are. And right now, our policy has said there's a lot of discretion for individual instructors, subject to these sort of broader parameters. Some of the things that Laura was talking about, like assessments, passing off plagiarism concerns. Obviously, those are hard boundaries, but within that, there's a lot more flexibility. I would say, if I was on a hiring committee, what I would want to hear is just something that you thought and reflected on the problem and had considered the question. And I think free speech is similar. Again, there's sort of a hard limit. I also think, though, that is part of a broad, there's the free speech questions, but then there's, I think, a broader set of questions that are important that I think a lot of schools are thinking about, like how do you grapple with disagreement on core issues in the classroom, and that's I think something I could imagine committees asking about, and that's not not necessarily about do you shut people down or like when do you intervene and say stop talking, but more a question of how do you handle those students sharply disagreeing with each other, getting upset. If you're curious, like what I've seen be effective, everyone I've talked to when you ask this question, has said, like among my colleagues, almost always the answer tends to be that rarely comes up because we've set the ground rules very clearly at the outset. Like, so much of teaching is sort of anticipating, being transparent, being clear, and helping set those limits. And I will say, in my experience teaching, you know, a lot of law these days, but not just these days, is fraught, complicated topics. But I've seen those conversations go very well precisely if you know, when you do take the time to set up them and provide the structure.
Can I say one thing, which is if you want to learn, by the way, about AI and teaching, there's some professors at LSU that created the AI Law Professors Sandbox, I think it's called. Hang on. The Law Profs AI Sandbox. You can go read about that. They invite other faculty to send their ideas, their assignments, their policies, everything in their kind of a, you know, they hold all that. Go ahead.
Okay, let's go to more questions. Okay, over here.
Hi, thank you guys so much for spending the time to speak to us. I have a question in terms of, I'm quite new to teaching, and something that I've never really wrapped my head around is office hours and what to really do with that time, because I think it's a great opportunity, but it really depends on whether students are actually going to engage and what kind of questions they have, and so if you have any thoughts in terms of what to use that time for, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I find that it depends a lot on what year they are and how accustomed they are to coming in and feeling comfortable asking questions. One of the things, I mean, I do lots of things, including just having open office hours, but one of the things I've been playing with to get people who are less comfortable coming to office hours is picking a topic for a given day. Today, this is going to be the topic in office hours, and so you can just come and listen to everybody talk about that topic, but just so the people don't have to come up with their own ideas about what are my questions. But to be clear, I also have lots of just regular open office hours.
I was going to say that I do office hours not in my office. I do it out in the main atrium area where everyone is around a table, so that anyone who might not feel, sometimes they feel intimidated about going to your office, and then you're cramped in this little office, or there's a line out the door. So I do it all open all the time.
Great.
So I've found that students have a bunch of different reasons why they want to come to office hours, and it's worth thinking about what those reasons are. I mean, some students have been told you should get to know your professors, and so they will come to your office hours and they'll be like, I'm very curious about your research, and I'm like, no, you're not. But I understand what they are. I understand what they are doing, and so I think you want to. And then there are some students who really just want like answers about the content. So I think you want to think about a bunch of different spaces to meet students where they are. And I'll just tell you the range of ways that I do that. So one, like, there are the podium questions at the end of class that will come up and students will approach you. And so you should just budget some time in for that at the end of each class if you can. Like, just anticipate there will be 5 to 10 minutes of students coming up and just be ready for that. If you have the time, one of the things I do is I set up lunches for the students over the course of the quarter where we can just get to know each other, and that takes the pressure off of them to come to the office hours if what they want to do is just get to know you a little bit. And then I try to for the formal office hours, I try to have different formats, which I sort of hit on after years of not doing this. I have one set of individual sign-up office hours where, you know, you reserve an appointment. I find 20 minutes is sort of the ideal amount of time. And students can come and ask specific questions. Maybe they have some project that they're working on that they want your advice on, or, you know. And then I also I will be sitting in this spot for an hour between this time period, and you can all come. And many students come and they just want to hear the other students' questions. So I think having both sets of office hours to meet different kinds of students' needs is really valuable.
Yeah. It's also just very school by school, kind of the culture of office hours. I think some other things that weren't mentioned, I have colleagues who will just have some of their office hours be the hour after class, so you can just continue those podium conversations. I have some colleagues who require them, like it's part of, you know, to get their grade, they have to have come to at least office hours one time. And then there's the kind of, holding some time, scheduling. Are you somebody who's going to schedule for students who can't make it to those office hours for whatever reason? Are you going to have different office hours for them? So there's lots of kind of choices, and I would say it's worth experimenting and thinking through those options. I saw a question from over here.
Laura mentioned the importance of supporting first-generation students, and this question's for everyone. What skill sets should people who are going on the legal job market be preparing, and what have you found the most success with in your law schools? What's needed in the classroom for first-gen students?
Go ahead, Laura.
So there's a few things. We luckily have a first-gen student organization, and the faculty advisor for them puts out to all the faculty some tips, right? So some of the things are, first off, it's really important that you show up as yourself in the classroom and let them know who you are, right? So that they can see that you're a real person and you're not like this complete ivory tower person in the classroom. But another thing is to realize that if you required, not that there's anything wrong with your colleague, but if you required them to come to your office hours and it really was, your office was down like this scary path where they had to walk by a bunch of other law professors and they're going to show up, they're not going to know who's going to be there. You might not, they may not feel comfortable in that type of situation, and they may not seek it out themselves, right? So providing opportunities for people to feel like they can connect with you, and also making safe spaces for them to be able to connect on the material. So some of the things that we do to accommodate that population is, we don't have every faculty member can do what they want, but a lot of our faculty members don't do cold calling, for instance. You tell people you're on during this week, and you can come the week before and meet with the professor and make sure you understand the information if you don't want to speak up in class. Basically ways to make people feel more comfortable in the classroom when they may not have had to deal with this sort of situation before.
Do you want to add anything, Kristen?
Unless you want to move on.
No, add. Do you have anything to add, please?
I think it's important to remember that students just come with an incredibly wide range of skills to law school. Some of that is about whether their parents went to college, and some of it is about what they majored in and what they talked about at dinner with their friends, and whatever. There's a zillion reasons. And so just back to my basic teaching things, right? You can assume brilliance, but don't assume knowledge, right? And so building skill sets and building opportunities for repetition, feedback, all of those kinds of things. And for what it's worth, I work very closely with first-gen students, and I cold call like crazy because I think it's really important to get their voices in the classroom. And I do it you've met me now, I'm as kind and gentle as can be. So I don't think it's terribly scary, and I think that they get to hear from other first-gen students in the room too. It's like, oh, yeah, we belong here.
Yeah, I'll just make one quick plug. So a colleague who teaches here at Berkeley, Malika Kaur, and I put out a book, a co-edited volume called How to Account for Trauma and Emotions in Law Teaching. And it's not really like a how-to guide, because it really is, everybody has to find their own way with this, but our position really is that you need to figure out a way to do this, right? And to account for different experiences people have coming into the classroom. One of the contributing chapter authors is Andrew Bratt, who teaches Civ Pro here and uses the Socratic method. And he talks about how he does that, right? This kind of more gentle Socratic method to create space for that, at the same time honoring the fact that people have different lived experiences and different relationships with the law. Okay. Greg?
Just very quickly, one of the things I've seen with first-gen students is that there's a sense, this is a little bit outside the classroom, that everybody else has some sort of secret knowledge and has some playbook that they know what they're doing, and the first-gen students feel like they don't have that. And so the more you can both just explain, no one has it all figured out, and also make these processes as transparent and explicit as possible, that is incredibly valuable. And so, whether it comes to things like clerkships, law review, the first-gen students often feel like they are starting from behind and so the more you can demystify and clarify, I think that is really important work.
Absolutely. Okay, we have a little bit more time. Yeah, in the middle.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll come to you first, Greg, as someone who has taught 5th grade.
Yes, I mean, the 5th grade, you know, my students sometimes joke that they feel like all their professors should teach 5th graders, which I honestly feel like would not be a bad thing. Like, many of the skills turn out to be transferable. But I did also teach PhD students or undergrads when I was doing my PhD program. I taught, you know, besides teaching law students. You know, I actually think talking about the set of skills that, I mean, because many people also are legal writing fellows as well, so that's a different kind of teaching experience as well. I do think that many of the skills are transferable, right? That there are things about teaching a large podium class that you have to learn by teaching a large podium class, but many of the things that make up good teaching are just good practices in general. And I would say many of the things that Kristen talked about, right? Like, you know, being humble, being authentic to yourself, like being transparent, being clear. You know, I think this is also true in the clinical space, right? Many of the core set of skills, I think, transfer. And so if you can talk about that in your responses and talk about the ways that you envision in transferring some of those skills to a podium class, I think that's going to be the most effective. Because it can't be, it is not a requirement on the entry-level teaching market that everyone has taught a large doctrinal class. Like, you know, my colleagues and I recognize that limitation. And so I think what we want to hear about is the teaching that you have done, what skills you have developed, and then how you anticipate applying that.
Other thoughts in response to that one? Okay, let's get, way in the back? Yes, hi, yep, you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Do you have any words of advice for seminar-style teaching and how you would compare that to doctrinal? I guess both from a practical perspective and then maybe comments on the market, if you get kind of a compare how you would do doctrinal seminar, maybe both of those parts.
I mean, I'll say really quickly that I find seminar teaching incredibly difficult. Like, to me, it's much harder than teaching a doctrinal class, but I know there are people who think the reverse. It's just easier to put on a show a little bit in a doctrinal class and move forward. So when I teach seminar-style classes, I give a lot more responsibility to the students. I put, like, every week, there are some subset of the students who are responsible for being discussants. And then, I don't know, maybe it's just to make it easier for me, but I also feel like then they take ownership and better conversations happen as a result.
So I'll say strategically, when you're on the market, like, people don't care as much about the seminars because the view is that the seminars are for you, whatever you're interested in. And I mean, it's not that they don't, I just think it's very unlikely you'll get asked about the seminars. The interest, because the interest is primarily going to be on the doctrinal side. Like Kristen, I find seminars very frustrating and harder than the doctrinals. In part because law students, they might have been conditioned, like when they were undergrads, perhaps they happily and freely contributed to seminars, and then suddenly they get to law school and they think it's like being on call, and so they sort of really become risk averse and cautious sometimes and hesitant to speak up. And so I try to, and they all talk through the faculty member, which is always their inclination, is to talk to you. Very frustrating. So one thing I found, I just take myself out. I mean, in some ways, I was just like, you are going to talk now for 10 minutes. I'm not going to say anything. It can, you know, and you just have to power through the awkward silences and just not resist the temptation to step in and fill the space. But I also have in some ways stopped teaching seminars and shifted over to teaching many of the policy labs in lieu of seminars because I find it I think the students find it a more rewarding experience because of the practical experience, and I find it a more rewarding experience sometimes as well.
I'll just add a couple points on seminar teaching. Yeah, I agree you're not going to be asked about it because that's not the priority, right? Law schools have like core needs they need to fill. But I do think like the flipped classroom is very common in seminar teaching, even having students responsible for teaching whole classes. I like to leave room in the syllabus, so like have a few classes that we don't have a topic for yet so that you can kind of poll the students and be responsive to their interests. Students are going to have signed up for, you know, a reproductive justice seminar for lots of different reasons potentially. And so you want to kind of be responsive to what they're coming in, what their motivations are. But I do agree that they're actually more work in some sense, because you are maybe more responsive to the individual student interest, to current events. And so I find that like it just changes more semester to semester, whereas maybe, you know, your property class like largely stays the same, takes into account some changes in law, you weave in different things. So we are at time, 3:01. So I think we have to cut you off, but I know I'm happy to stay and answer questions. I think there's closing remarks in a little bit. Jonathan, did you want to close things out? Just want to thank these three panelists for taking time out of their summers to come and chat with you all and share their wealth of knowledge and experience and insight. So thank you again to the three of you.
Okay. So I want to thank you again all for joining us today. This is concluding our program, and you should expect to receive, maybe from us, maybe from AALS, some kind of survey instrument via email about the program. Please fill it out. We haven't done this before, and there are regional events like this hosted by UC Irvine to the south, New York Law School in New York, the University of Houston Law Center, Northwestern in Chicago. They're all doing this. None of us had any idea how many people were going to show up. Thank you for coming. I was joking that, you know, if 20 people showed, I would consider this a success. The fact that so many of you are here is both gratifying and suggests maybe there's a need for this. Maybe we should do this again next year. It would be super useful to know from all of you whether that's right, whether there are additional things you would like us to cover. You get the idea. When you get that survey, please take a few minutes to fill it out, and thank you in advance for taking the time. Before I let you all go, I also need to thank a few people who made this happen, most of whom are not actually in the room, so this is for the recording, I guess. But Jenny Boyden and Julianne Enriquez and Bella Lopez have made everything work. They're the reason you had coffee and lunch. Susanna Spiro and Alex Shapiro got the word out so you all knew about it, and put together a classy website in like no time. I won't even tell you how much time it would have taken me to, anyway. Our dean not only supported us, but funded the coffee and lunch, and Whitney Mello in the dean's office handled the logistics of actually making that happen. Associate deans at the law schools you've heard from today helped find us speakers, often shared their experience directly with you. So thank you to everyone who not only read and responded to all my emails interrupting their summers, which presumably would otherwise have had them in the south of France, but also stepped up to help make this happen. So Dean Ratner, who you heard from before, Professor Ablavsky, Dean Norris, Professor Harris, as well as Dean Shestowski at UC Davis, who couldn't be here, and Dave Owen at UC Law SF, and Professor Ablavsky, your colleague Evelyn Dweck at Stanford Law School, who also couldn't make it today. And the last thing I just want to say is I wish that before I went on the meat market a little while ago, that I would have had the wisdom to come to an event like this to learn the kinds of stuff that you've heard from these panels today. So I'm going to ask you to thank once again our panelists for taking their time and sharing their wisdom. You guys have gotten a treasure trove of information that I wish I had had before entering law teaching. So thank you all again for coming out today.